Extinguishing the Flames, The Dark Secrets of a Cursed Village. Chapter 1, Whispers of the Flame. Ellen Turner had always been drawn to the stories no one else would touch. Her desk at the small independent magazine where she worked was cluttered with yellowing newspaper clippings, cryptic notes scribbled in the margins of journals, and a stack of half-finished drafts detailing everything from haunted hotels to cursed graveyards. To her, the world was filled with unsolved mysteries, waiting for someone brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to dig deep enough to uncover the truth. And Ellen Turner was nothing if not curious. That curiosity had driven her to some of the strangest corners of the country, but nothing had piqued her interest, quite like the rumor she had stumbled across one late evening. It came from an unexpected source, overheard in the corner of a dimly lit diner while she was mindlessly sipping her third cup of coffee. Two men, speaking in low tones, mentioned a place she'd never heard of before, Ashgrove, a small village hidden away in the remote forests of Maine. A village where, according to these men, fire had been outlawed. It wasn't the strangeness of the rule that caught Ellen's attention, but the reason why. "Anyone who dares to light a flame," one of the men whispered, "doesn't live to see the next sunrise." Ellen had leaned in closer, her heart racing with the kind of excitement that came only when she knew she was on the verge of something big. She barely caught the rest of the conversation, but it was enough to spark an obsession. A village where fire was forbidden, where lighting so much as a match could spell disaster. There had to be more to the story, and whatever it was, she intended to find out. Now, a week later, Ellen sat in the back of a rented Jeep, flipping through the rough notes she had made while researching Ashgrove. The town had practically disappeared from the map, its history fragmented and shrouded in mystery. There were a few scattered mentions in dusty library archives and vague references in local legends, but nothing concrete. The deeper she dug, the more elusive the village became, almost as if it didn't want to be found. Ellen wasn't the type to back down when the trail went cold, though. If anything, the challenge only made her more determined. She glanced up from her notebook and caught sight of Mark Daniels, the team's cameraman, adjusting his equipment in the passenger seat. Mark was a stark contrast to her own passionate pursuit of the supernatural. A born skeptic, Mark had spent his career debunking urban legends and ghost stories, convinced that there was always a logical explanation behind every strange occurrence. "So, remind me again why we're driving to the middle of nowhere," Mark asked, not bothering to look away from the camera as he fine-tuned the settings. "Because," Ellen said with a grin, "there's something out there that people are afraid to talk about. I've heard rumors, whispers about a village where fire is forbidden, and I want to know why." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Forbidden fire? What's next? A town where water's illegal?" Ellen ignored his sarcasm, her mind already racing ahead to what they might find. Sitting next to her, staring out the window at the passing forest, was Sarah Walsh, a firm believer in the supernatural, and someone who had been Ellen's research partner for years. Sarah's face was serious, her thoughts clearly focused on the rumors they had uncovered about Ashgrove. "Ellen's right," Sarah said quietly, still looking out the window. "This isn't just some local superstition. There's something real about this. I can feel it. The stories, they're too consistent to ignore." Mark sighed, glancing back at her. "You always think there's something supernatural going on. What if it's just some backwoods town with weird traditions? People come up with crazy rules for all kinds of reasons." "Maybe," Ellen chimed in. "But don't you think it's strange that nobody will talk about what happens when someone lights a fire? And the people who've tried, they all disappeared, Mark. They're not just weird rules. There's something dangerous about that place, and we need to find out what it is." Mark rolled his eyes, but he didn't argue further. He knew Ellen well enough to understand that once she had her sights set on a story, there was no stopping her. Later that day, they arrived at a small town just outside the forest where Ashgrove was rumored to be located. Ellen insisted they stop to speak with some of the locals before heading into the village itself, hoping to gather any last bits of information that might help them once they got there. The diner they stepped into felt like it had been pulled straight from the 1950s. It was quiet inside, with a handful of older patrons scattered across the booths. The air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and coffee that had been brewing far too long. Ellen approached the counter and ordered a round of coffee, while Mark and Sarah took a seat at a corner table. As she waited, she struck up a conversation with the waitress, an older woman with graying hair pulled into a loose bun. "You're not from around here, are you?" the waitress asked, eyeing Ellen with a curious expression. "Nope," Ellen replied, keeping her tone light. "We're just passing through. Actually, we were thinking of heading up to Ashgrove. Ever heard of it?" The effect was immediate. The waitress froze, her eyes widening in shock before quickly shifting into something more guarded. "You don't want to go there," she said flatly, her voice low. "Ain't nothing up there but bad memories and worse luck." Ellen's pulse quickened. "What do you mean by that?" The waitress shook her head. "People don't come back from that place. Not whole, anyway. There's things you're better off not knowing about. If I were you, I'd turn that car around and head back the way you came." "But why?" "What's up there?" Ellen pressed, but the waitress had already turned away, refilling a pot of coffee as if the conversation was over. Back at the table, Ellen shared what she'd learned, though it wasn't much. The reaction was the same wherever they went. People were quick to shut down the moment they mentioned Ashgrove, their faces going pale, as if the village carried some sort of unspeakable curse. "This isn't normal," Sarah murmured, glancing around at the other patrons, who all seemed to have become uncomfortably interested in their meals. "They know something they're too scared to talk about." Ellen nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we're going." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get the feeling we're walking into some kind of horror movie. You realize how many times the people in those movies are warned to stay away, right?" "Yeah," Ellen said with a grin. "But if they listened, where would the fun be?" The road to Ashgrove was narrow and winding, barely more than a dirt trail cutting through the dense forest. The trees grew so thickly on either side that the sunlight barely penetrated, casting the whole world in shadow. Sarah watched the trees pass by in silence, her fingers drumming nervously on the door. "This place feels off," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Ellen, focused on the road, nodded slightly but said nothing. She felt it too. The way the air seemed heavier, the way the forest itself seemed to be closing in around them. Chapter 2. Entering the Forbidden. The village of Ashgrove appeared through the tangled woods like a ghost, its outlines soft and smudged against the gray afternoon sky. As the car rolled to a stop on the unpaved road, Ellen, Sarah, and Mark found themselves staring at the bleak scene in front of them. Low, worn-out cottages clustered together as if huddling for warmth, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. A biting chill clung to the air, seeping through the windows of the car, though it was the middle of summer. The absence of fire was not just a rule, it had left a mark on this place, a coldness that seemed to seep into the very soul of the village. Ellen stepped out first, her breath visible in the unnaturally cool air, a rare occurrence this time of year. She rubbed her hands together for warmth, but it did little to push away the feeling of unease that crept over her skin. "Feels colder than it should be, doesn't it?" she murmured, more to herself than to her companions. Mark followed, camera slung over his shoulder. His usual bravado was tempered by the oppressive atmosphere. "No wonder no one wants to come out here. This place feels dead." "Not dead," Sarah corrected quietly as she joined them, her eyes scanning the village with a distant, haunted look. "Just forgotten, like it's been left behind by time." The three of them stood there for a long moment, taking in the stillness of the village. There was no movement, no sign of life beyond the buildings themselves, which seemed to sag under an invisible weight. There was no smoke rising from chimneys, no scent of food cooking or wood burning, just an unnatural quiet that seemed to hang over everything. Ellen was the first to break the silence, her investigative instincts kicking in. "We need to talk to someone," she said, determination settling into her voice. "Find out why they've banned fire and what's really going on here." They walked down the narrow dirt path that served as the village's main street. As they passed, they caught glimpses of shadowy figures peeking from behind tattered curtains, watching them with eyes full of suspicion. Occasionally, a door would creak open just an inch before slamming shut again. The inhabitants of Ashgrove were wary, their fear hanging in the air like the chill that surrounded them. Mark glanced around uneasily, lowering his voice. "You think these people are hiding something?" "Definitely," Ellen replied, keeping her voice steady. "They're scared of something, and I intend to find out what." At the far end of the village, they finally spotted a figure. A man, bent and grizzled with age, sat on a worn-out porch, smoking a pipe. His eyes, sharp and glittering, followed them as they approached. Ellen stepped forward, putting on her most approachable smile. "Excuse me, sir," she began. "We're here investigating some rumors about your village. We were wondering if you could tell us why fire isn't allowed here." The old man's eyes narrowed as he took another long puff from his pipe. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer, but then he exhaled slowly, the smoke swirling in the cold air like ghostly tendrils. "Ain't no one in Ashgrove talking about that," he said gruffly. "You'd best turn round and leave while you can." Ellen pressed on. "Please, we just want to understand. There must be a reason for the rule." The man spat on the ground, his gaze hard. "Reason don't matter no more. What matters is staying alive. And fire. It don't bring nothing but death here. You'd do well to remember that." Before Ellen could ask more, he stood, gathering his things, and hobbled back into his house, slamming the door behind him. The sharp sound echoed through the silent street, and for a moment all they could do was stand there in the growing cold. Mark shook his head, looking up at the sky as if searching for answers in the gathering clouds. "This place gives me the creeps. No one wants to talk. No fire. No explanations. It's like they're hiding from something they don't even understand." Ellen sighed in frustration. "We'll have to try again tomorrow. Someone here knows the truth. We just need to get them to talk." As dusk fell over the village, the team settled into the small cabin they had rented for the night. The walls were rough, the floors creaky, and the windows covered with heavy, moth-eaten curtains. It was as if the very structure of the place had absorbed the fear that gripped the village, every corner steeped in unease. Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the darkening forest beyond, her breath fogging the glass. "There's something out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it, something, watching us." Ellen paused from unpacking her gear, glancing over at her friend. Sarah had always been sensitive to things beyond the physical, her instincts sharper than anyone else's. And right now, Sarah looked more unnerved than Ellen had ever seen her. "You think it's something supernatural?" Ellen asked carefully, her mind racing through the possibilities. Sarah nodded slowly. "It's more than just a superstition. I don't think these people are afraid of fire itself. I think they're afraid of what it summons." Mark snorted from the corner where he was setting up his equipment. "Oh, come on. What's next? A fire demon? We've been here one day, and already we're jumping to conclusions." But Ellen wasn't so sure. The tension in the air was undeniable. There was something in this village, something that had the villagers terrified to light even a candle. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The cold seemed to grow deeper, the walls of the cabin groaning softly in the night. Ellen tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she knew no one had followed them inside. In the dead of night, a sharp sound echoed through the room, a slow, scraping noise that made Ellen bolt upright in her bed. She held her breath, listening. The sound came again, a low, rhythmic carving noise. Mark stirred next to her, blinking groggily. "What's that?" he muttered, half asleep. Ellen's heart raced as she got out of bed, motioning for silence. She crept toward the wall where the sound was coming from, her eyes scanning the darkened room. Slowly, she reached out and touched the wall. Beneath her fingertips, she felt something, rough, uneven grooves etched into the wood. She scrambled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. As the beam illuminated the wall, her blood ran cold. There, carved into the wood, were strange, unfamiliar symbols, jagged and crude. They spiraled across the wall, each one etched with a precision that sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah, now wide awake, moved closer, her eyes wide with alarm. "Those weren't there before." Ellen nodded, her mind racing. The symbols seemed ancient, their meaning lost to time, but they radiated a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Something, or someone, had marked their cabin in the dead of night. But why? Mark rubbed his eyes, staring at the carvings. "All right, this is officially messed up. We should leave. Like, now." But Ellen shook her head. "No. We came here for answers, and we're going to get them. Something doesn't want us here, and that means we're close to finding out the truth." Sarah was still staring at the symbols, her face pale. "Whatever it is, it's not just a story. It's real, and it's watching us." Chapter 3. The First Spark. The tension had been building for days, festering beneath the surface like a wound that wouldn't heal. By the time the sun set on their third day in Ashgrove, the weight of the village's silence had become unbearable. Ellen could feel it pressing down on them, the frustration in the air growing thicker with each passing hour. Mark had been the first to crack. He stood by the window of their creaky cabin, arms crossed, eyes narrowed into the fading twilight outside. His camera was abandoned in the corner, unused. "I've had enough of this," he muttered under his breath. "We've been tiptoeing around this whole fire nonsense like it's some kind of real thing, but there's nothing here. Just a bunch of scared villagers and stupid superstitions." Ellen, seated at the small wooden table with her notebook open in front of her, looked up. "Mark, you heard what they said. Every person we talked to was too scared to even mention fire, let alone light one. Maybe we should. Maybe we should stop listening to a bunch of paranoid locals," he interrupted, his voice hard. He turned, his expression dark. "Look, I'm not spending another night freezing in this dump. We're lighting a fire, cooking some food, and maybe, just maybe, we'll prove that all of this is nothing but stories." Sarah, who had been nervously pacing by the doorway, glanced over at Ellen, her eyes wide with worry. "Mark, please, we don't know what could happen. It might not be safe." But Mark was already rummaging through his bag, pulling out a small camping stove and a packet of matches. His movements were sharp, almost reckless. "Safe? Sarah, nothing's happening because there's nothing to be afraid of." He struck the match, and the small flame flickered to life. The warmth of it seemed out of place in the cold, dreary cabin. Ellen felt her heart lurch as the flame took hold, small but defiant in the dim light. She wanted to stop him, to insist that they follow the warnings, but a part of her was curious too. The journalist in her craved answers, even if they were hidden in dangerous places. Mark set the stove up on the floor and ignited it, the small blue flame hissing as it caught. He placed a pot on top, pouring in some water from a nearby bottle. "See?" he said, his tone triumphant. "Nothing's happening. No ghosts, no curses, just hot water." But as the fire crackled, something else stirred in the air. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, rattling the thin windows in their frames. Ellen felt the temperature drop sharply, the chill creeping under her skin. She glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone pale, her eyes wide with dread. Mark, oblivious, started stirring the pot, whistling a tuneless melody. But Ellen's attention was pulled elsewhere. From the corner of her eye, she saw something move outside, just beyond the flickering firelight. A shadow, long and shifting, darted between the trees at the edge of the woods. It was too fast, too fluid to be a person. She stiffened, her heartbeat quickening. "Did you see that?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the same spot. "There's something out there." Before Ellen could respond, a low, eerie sound drifted through the night. A howl, not animal nor human, but something in between. It echoed through the village, sending a shiver down her spine. The fire on the stove flickered wildly, as if reacting to the sound, and the cold wind rushed in again, this time slamming the door with a loud bang. Mark stopped whistling, his hand hovering over the pot. "What the hell was that?" "That," Ellen said, her voice tight, "was what they were warning us about." Before anyone could say another word, the shadows outside grew thicker, darker. Shapes began to materialize in the distance, black figures moving slowly closer to the cabin. They were formless at first, indistinct, but as they neared the glow of the fire, their outlines sharpened. Ellen could make out hunched figures, their limbs too long, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if drawn to the flame. Sarah backed up against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. "We need to put out the fire. Now." Mark, however, seemed frozen in place, staring at the figures as if in a trance. What are they?" Ellen reached out to shake him, but the moment her hand touched his arm, she recoiled. His skin was hot to the touch, feverish. Mark's eyes flicked toward her, but there was something wrong in them. His pupils were dilated, his gaze unfocused, as if he wasn't really seeing her. "They're coming for me," he whispered, his voice distant and slurred. I shouldn't have. Ellen's chest tightened with fear. "Mark, we need to put out the fire. It's attracting them." But Mark wasn't listening. He staggered to his feet, clutching his head, his breathing uneven. No, they're inside me. They're in my head. I can hear them, whispering." The eerie figures outside seemed to pulse with life, their movements synchronized with Mark's increasingly erratic behavior. They crept closer, their faces still hidden in shadow, but their presence was suffocating. Ellen could feel the air growing thicker, colder, with each step they took. Suddenly, Mark let out a guttural scream and lunged for the door, his eyes wide with terror. He threw it open and stumbled into the night, disappearing into the darkness before Ellen or Sarah could react. "Mark!" Ellen shouted, rushing after him, but she stopped short as she reached the threshold. The figures were there, hovering just beyond the firelight, watching her with empty black eyes. She could feel their gaze pierce through her, cold and malevolent. Behind her, Sarah was trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "They took him. They're going to take him." Ellen's mind raced, her hands shaking. She knew they had to put out the fire, but the sight of the figures, the unnatural, menacing shapes lurking just outside, froze her in place. And then suddenly, the fire flickered and went out on its own, snuffed by an unseen force. The moment the flame died, the figures vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if they had never been there. But the cold lingered, and the fear in the air was thicker than ever. Ellen and Sarah stood in the doorway, shivering, staring into the blackness where Mark had disappeared. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest. Something ancient, something dangerous had been unleashed, and now Mark was gone. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Ellen lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The eerie figures, the unnatural cold, Mark's sudden change, it all swirled together in her thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. She finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by a whisper. At first, she thought it was Sarah, but the voice was wrong, too low, too close. And then it came again, soft but insistent, "Ellen." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, but the room was empty, save for Sarah, who was fast asleep across the room. The voice called again, this time more clearly. "Ellen, you are the key." Her heart raced as the whisper faded, leaving her in the deafening silence of the cabin. She sat up, clutching her blanket tightly. What did it mean? Why was it calling her? And what had they unleashed by breaking the village's one terrible rule? Chapter 4: Echoes of the Past. Morning broke over the village in a pale, reluctant light. The events of the previous night clung to the air like a lingering mist, heavy, thick, and inescapable. Ellen sat by the window, her eyes scanning the dense trees that surrounded the village, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of Mark. He had vanished into the dark, swallowed by the shadows that had appeared at the first sign of flame. Now, with the fire extinguished, an uneasy calm had settled over Ashgrove, but it did little to ease the gnawing fear in her chest. Sarah, as determined as ever, sat at the rickety wooden table, poring over a bundle of old, dusty books she had found stacked in the corner of their cabin. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, fingers delicately flipping through pages yellowed with age. She hadn't said much since Mark had disappeared, her expression tight, her eyes reflecting the same questions that burned in Ellen's mind. Where was he? What had happened to him? And perhaps more disturbingly, what would happen next? "I think I've found something," Sarah finally muttered, breaking the heavy silence that had hung over them all morning. Ellen turned toward her, snapping out of her thoughts. "What is it?" Sarah held up an old leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn, the edges frayed. "It's a diary. One of the villagers must have kept it from a long time ago." Ellen's pulse quickened as she moved to sit beside her. The journal looked ancient, its brittle pages filled with spidery handwriting, faded from time but still legible. "What does it say?" Sarah hesitated before speaking, as if the words themselves were too disturbing to voice. "It mentions a curse. A long time ago, there was some kind of ritual, something meant to harness power from the elements, particularly fire. But it went wrong. The spirits they summoned, they couldn't control them. The village has been haunted ever since, bound by this curse. Ellen leaned closer, her eyes scanning the inked words. The more she read, the more an unsettling feeling grew inside her. A curse tied to fire, Sarah nodded. They're not just afraid of fire. They're terrified of it because it brings the spirits back, stronger, more dangerous every time. That's why fire is forbidden here. Every spark, every flame feeds them. Ellen's heart skipped a beat as her mind flashed back to the previous night. The dark figures drawn to the small campfire, the way they had seemed to emerge from the very shadows around them. And then there was Mark, his sudden, terrifying change. Could it be that by lighting the fire, they had unleashed something far worse than superstition? Sarah turned a few more pages, her fingers trembling slightly. There's more. The spirits. They're not just aimlessly haunting this place. They're looking for something or someone. Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Sarah pointed to a page where a crude drawing had been made, depicting a strange circular symbol etched into the margin. The design was intricate, woven with sharp lines and curves that spiraled inward, drawing the eye toward its center. This symbol, it's mentioned several times. It's tied to the curse somehow, to the one the spirits seek. Ellen stared at the symbol, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen it before, though not in any book or ancient manuscript. Slowly, hesitantly, she pulled back the sleeve of her shirt to reveal her forearm. There, etched into her skin since birth, was the exact same symbol. Sarah's eyes widened, her face paling as she looked from Ellen's arm to the drawing in the book. Ellen? That's... Ellen's mind was racing. She had always known the mark was unusual, had even joked about it being her birthmark from the stars, but now it seemed like something far more sinister. How is this possible? She whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. What does this mean? Sarah was visibly shaken. This can't be a coincidence. The spirits are drawn to you, Ellen. That's why you've been having those nightmares. That's why they whispered your name. The memory of the voice came rushing back, soft, insistent, calling to her in the dead of night. You are the key. I don't understand, Ellen said, her voice trembling. Why me? What am I supposed to unlock? Before Sarah could respond, a loud knock on the door made them both jump. The door creaked open, and one of the villagers, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, stepped inside. Her expression was grim, her voice low and strained. You've angered them, she said, her gaze fixed on Ellen. The fire has stirred their wrath, and now they will come for what they seek. Ellen exchanged a glance with Sarah, fear coiling tightly in her chest. What do they want? The woman's gaze didn't waver. The one who bears the mark. They've been waiting for you. The rest of the day passed in a blur of dread and confusion. Ellen could barely focus, her mind swirling with questions and fear. The villagers continued to keep their distance, whispering among themselves whenever the team passed by. The once cold reception from the locals now felt like thinly veiled terror. That evening, as the sky darkened, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the air turning sharp and biting. Ellen sat alone near the window, her breath clouding the glass. She stared at the strange birthmark on her arm, running her fingers over the symbol's grooves, trying to make sense of it all. How could she be connected to an ancient curse in a forgotten village she had never visited before? Suddenly, Sarah appeared at her side, holding the old journal open to the last page. There's something you need to see. Ellen looked down, her pulse quickening as she read the final entry, scrawled hastily across the page. The one with the mark will come. She will be the key to unlocking the flame's final power, and the village will burn. Ellen's breath hitched in her throat. The village will burn? Sarah nodded grimly. It sounds like they've been waiting for you, Ellen. All this time, it's like you're part of the curse. A cold dread settled over Ellen, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. If I'm the key, she whispered, then what happens next? Sarah's face was pale, her voice barely audible. I think the spirits are growing stronger because you're here. Every fire, every whisper, it's all connected to you. Ellen stared at the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come to Ash Grove seeking answers, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. What if the truth was far more dangerous than any story she had ever uncovered? In the distance, a low, haunting howl echoed through the woods, chilling Ellen to the bone. The village was on edge, and the spirits, drawn to her, hungry for power, were waiting for her next move. Night fell once again, but sleep eluded Ellen. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of the puzzle: her strange birthmark, the village's dark history, the spirits bound to fire. Every clue pointed to one conclusion: she was at the center of something much larger than herself. Something ancient, something terrifying. But what? As the hours passed, a gnawing unease settled in the pit of her stomach. Ellen knew that whatever the spirits were waiting for, it was coming. The shadows in the woods seemed to be growing thicker, creeping closer with each passing moment. And with them, the flames of the curse flickered ever nearer. Ellen was no longer just an observer in this story. She was the key, but to what end, she still had no idea. Chapter 5: The Awakening. The oppressive cold of Ashgrove pressed against Ellen as if the air itself were suffocating her. The once quiet cabin was now a prison of invisible forces. Objects shifted in the shadows, faint whispers brushed the edge of her hearing, and every flicker of light seemed to bend and twist unnaturally. The spirits, whatever they were no longer passive. They were watching, waiting, growing bolder by the hour. Ellen lay awake, her eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling above, but her thoughts drifted back to the dreams. Vivid and haunting, they had been her constant companion since their arrival. In every dream, the same figure appeared, a faceless being, standing in a sea of flames, its voice whispering her name like a secret long kept. "You are the key. Free us." She blinked, pushing the memory aside. The last thing she needed was to unravel. She could hear Sarah's steady breathing across the room, but it did little to calm the storm inside her. A loud crash from the kitchen shattered the fragile stillness of the night. Ellen shot up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The crash was followed by the unmistakable sound of furniture scraping across the floor, as if being dragged by unseen hands. "Ellen, did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice thick with fear. Ellen nodded, though she doubted Sarah could see her in the dark. "Stay here," she whispered back, her voice trembling. She cautiously got out of bed and crept toward the source of the noise. The floor creaked beneath her feet, every step amplifying her anxiety. As she reached the kitchen doorway, a cold gust of wind rushed past her, despite the closed windows. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the room in disarray. Chairs overturned, cabinets flung open, and dishes scattered across the floor. But what froze her in place were the words scratched into the wooden table, carved deep into the surface as if by a clawed hand. "Embrace the flame." Her blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The spirits were not just watching. They were sending a message meant for her. "Ellen!" Sarah's panicked voice called from the other room. She rushed back, finding Sarah sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "It's happening again," she whispered, pointing toward the corner of the room. Ellen followed her gaze and felt her stomach lurch. A shadow, tall, dark, and formless, hovered near the far wall. It seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, its outline shifting like smoke. And then, without warning, it moved toward Ellen, the air growing colder as it neared. "Ellen?" The voice whispered, low and menacing. "You are the key. Free us." The temperature dropped further, and Ellen felt as if her bones had turned to ice. The shadow loomed closer, but instead of terror, she felt a strange pull. A part of her wanted to reach out, to let it in, to understand its message, but she shook her head, fighting the urge. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The shadow shifted, as if considering her question. "You must embrace the flame. Only then can we be free. Only then will the curse be lifted." The weight of the words pressed down on her. She could feel their meaning, like a heavy stone sinking deeper into her soul. There was a choice to be made, and every instinct screamed at her to resist. But what if they were right? What if she truly was the key to ending this nightmare? Before she could respond, the shadow dissipated into the air, leaving an icy silence in its wake. Morning came, though it did little to ease the tension in the cabin. The oppressive feeling from the night lingered, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Ellen sat at the table, staring at the carved message. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding and tangling in ways that left her feeling more confused than ever. Sarah sat across from her, watching her with concern. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Ellen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. "I did. But, Ellen, there's something else. Last night, while you were in the kitchen, I heard Mark talking in his sleep. At first, I thought he was just mumbling, but then he started saying things, strange things." Ellen leaned in, her heart sinking. "What did he say?" Sarah hesitated before speaking. "He kept talking about fire, about needing to burn everything down. He sounded different. Not like himself." Ellen felt a knot form in her stomach. "Where is he now?" Sarah glanced toward the back of the cabin. "He's been outside since early this morning. I tried talking to him, but he barely responded. He's not right, Ellen. Something's changed." Ellen stood, her mind racing. "I need to talk to him." She found Mark standing by the edge of the woods, his back to her. He was staring out at the trees, his posture tense and rigid. As she approached, she could see that his clothes were disheveled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mark?" she called out softly. He didn't respond. Instead, he muttered under his breath, his words barely audible but filled with an unsettling intensity. "It has to burn. Everything has to burn." Ellen's heart pounded. "Mark, what are you talking about?" He turned to her suddenly, his eyes wide and manic. "The fire, Ellen. Don't you see? It's the only way to release the power. We have to let it consume everything." She took a step back, fear creeping into her veins. "Mark, you're not thinking clearly. The fire." "No," he shouted, cutting her off. "You don't understand. They told me, Ellen. They told me what has to be done. You're the key, and I have to make sure it happens." Ellen's blood ran cold. "Who told you?" Mark's expression darkened, his face twisting with a strange combination of desperation and resolve. "The spirits. They've shown me the truth. I can see it now, Ellen. The fire. It's the only way to set them free. To set us free." Ellen felt her pulse quicken as she took another step back. "Mark, you need to calm down. This isn't you talking. It's them. You're not yourself." But Mark shook his head, his eyes glinting with a dangerous fervor. "No, Ellen, I'm exactly who I need to be. And soon, you will be too. You're part of this, whether you like it or not." Before she could respond, Mark turned and stormed off into the woods, disappearing among the trees. Ellen stood frozen, her mind spinning. Mark had changed. He was no longer the skeptical cameraman she had known. He was something else now, something dangerous. Back at the cabin, Ellen confided in Sarah, her voice low and filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do. Mark's not himself anymore. The spirits, they've gotten to him." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I've been thinking about that too, and there's something I haven't told you." She hesitated, then pulled the sleeve of her shirt up, revealing a small, faded mark on her arm. It was the same symbol from the diary, the same one Ellen had on her own skin. Ellen's eyes widened. You? You have it too?" Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "I've had it my whole life, just like you. I didn't think it meant anything, until now." Ellen stared at the mark, a sinking feeling growing in her chest. We're both connected to this? But why? What does it mean? "I don't know," Sarah said quietly. "But whatever it is, it's not good. The spirits are getting stronger, and Mark, he's losing himself. If we don't figure this out soon, I don't think any of us are getting out of here alive." Ellen felt a wave of dread wash over her. The truth was closing in, and with it, the realization that the spirits were not going to stop until their curse was fulfilled. And she was at the heart of it all. But what terrified her most was the growing part of herself that wondered, what if the spirits were right? What if she truly was the key to setting them free? And what would that cost her? Chapter 6, A Line in the Ashes. The air in the cabin was thick with dread as Ellen, Sarah, and the remaining members of the group faced one another in a tense standoff. Each moment stretched endlessly, filled with unspoken fears and anxious glances. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, mirroring the chaos brewing within their hearts. Ellen's mind raced. The choice before them was monumental. Abandon everything and flee the village, or confront the spirits to attempt to lift the ominous curse hanging over them. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but something deeper tugged at her heart, urging her to stay. It was as if the village itself was calling to her, whispering secrets only she could hear. "We have to confront this," Ellen said finally, her voice steady yet resolute. "We can't just run. We need to finish what we started, to understand why we're connected to all of this." Sarah looked uncertain, glancing at the others. "But what if it's too dangerous? Mark's already gone too far. We don't know what we're up against." "We're running out of time," Ellen insisted. "If we leave, who knows what will happen? The spirits will continue to grow stronger. We have to find out what they want and why they're drawn to us. This is our chance." As the group deliberated, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows flickered outside the windows, almost as if the spirits themselves were watching and waiting. The oppressive weight of their presence felt suffocating. Yet Ellen stood firm, driven by an unseen force. After what felt like hours, the group reluctantly agreed. They would seek answers, even if it led them deeper into the heart of darkness. Venturing outside, Ellen led the way, guided by an instinct she couldn't fully understand. She maneuvered through the forest, the trees closing in around them like the jaws of a great beast. Finally, they stumbled upon an overgrown path, hidden beneath layers of vines and brush. The air grew thick with an eerie energy as they followed the trail, the shadows around them whispering secrets lost to time. Eventually, they reached the entrance of a crumbling underground temple, its stone facade covered in moss and vines. It was an ancient place, forgotten and neglected, yet it pulsated with a power that made Ellen's skin tingle. As she stepped closer, an overwhelming sense of familiarity washed over her. It was as if she had walked these halls in another life, as if they were intertwined in a forgotten history. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Faded carvings lined the walls, depicting scenes of fire and ritualistic ceremonies. Ellen's breath quickened as she examined the illustrations, recognizing symbols similar to those etched into her skin. "This place, it's a site for ancient rituals," she murmured, tracing her fingers along the carvings. "They must have used fire to summon or control the spirits." Sarah stepped closer, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "Ellen, this is where they perform the ceremonies. We need to be careful. This place holds power, both dark and light." Just then, they heard a commotion outside, a frantic rustling that sent a wave of dread through the group. Mark emerged from the shadows, his eyes wide and frantic, but the expression on his face was not one of clarity. It was a wild mix of fear and zeal. "Ellen," he shouted, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "You need to see this." Before she could respond, Mark rushed past them and into the temple, clutching a bundle of dry branches and flammable materials. The urgency in his demeanor sent chills down Ellen's spine. "Mark, wait," she pleaded, reaching out as he barreled toward the center of the temple. But he was already on a path of his own, consumed by the spirit's whispers. With a flick of a match, the flames erupted into life, licking hungrily at the timber and quickly spreading. The fire crackled and roared, casting eerie shadows that danced upon the ancient walls. Ellen felt her heart race as the warmth enveloped her, but it was not the comfort of a campfire. It was a warning, an omen of chaos unleashed. "Stop," Ellen shouted, fear gripping her throat. "You don't know what you're doing." Mark turned to her, his expression a mix of madness and clarity. "I do, Ellen. This is what they want. We need to summon them. We have to free them, and only fire can do that." "You're wrong," she screamed, the reality of his actions sinking in. "This isn't freedom. It's destruction. You're feeding into their chaos." But Mark's eyes glinted with a fervor that chilled her to the bone. The spirits were no longer just whispering. They were shouting in his mind, drowning out any remnants of the man he once was. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the temple thickened. Ellen felt a primal fear coursing through her veins as the air grew heavy with a dark energy. The flames danced wildly, casting grotesque silhouettes across the walls. "Ellen," Mark said, his voice steady now, almost reverent. "They're here. We can set them free together. You just have to embrace your destiny." Ellen hesitated, torn between the man she once knew and the monstrous force he had become. The spirits swirled around her, their voices a cacophony of despair and longing. She felt their pull, their desire for her to join them in this darkness, but deep down, a flicker of resistance sparked within her. "No, Mark," she cried, stepping closer. "You have to fight them. You're stronger than this. We can find another way." But her words fell on deaf ears. Mark was lost, wholly consumed by the spirit's influence. He stepped deeper into the firelight, the heat radiating off him as if he were becoming one with the flames. "Join me, Ellen. Together, we can unleash their power." A horrific realization settled over her. To stop him, to end this madness, she might have to make an unimaginable sacrifice. Ellen's heart pounded as she looked around at her friends, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. If she was truly the key, then it was time to confront that truth. If it meant saving her friends and freeing the spirits, she was willing to risk everything, even her own life. As she prepared to confront Mark, the fire crackled ominously around her, whispering promises of power and destruction. Ellen stepped forward, ready to face the darkness head-on, even if it meant stepping into the flames herself. Chapter 7. The Key to the Flame. Ellen stood at the heart of the underground temple, her mind racing as the reality of her lineage crashed over her like a tidal wave. The flames flickered around her, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance to the frantic rhythm of her heart. Mark, lost to the whispers of the spirits, stood transfixed, a chaotic blend of passion and fury in his eyes. "You don't understand, Ellen," he shouted, his voice booming in the confined space, almost drowned out by the crackling fire. "You're one of them. This power is your birthright." As the truth began to crystallize in her mind, Ellen grasped the meaning of Mark's words. Her bloodline was intricately woven into the fabric of this cursed village, tied to the very ancestors who had unleashed this darkness upon the world. She was not just an outsider. She was the key, meant to either break the curse or become its conduit, binding the spirits forever. "Sarah, help me," Ellen cried, desperate for clarity amidst the chaos. She turned to her friend, who had been poring over a tattered, ancient text she had discovered hidden beneath the stone altar. "Ellen," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked up from the book, "I think I've found something. The only way to end the curse, it's you. You have to sacrifice yourself. You must become the vessel to contain the spirits." The words hung in the air, thick with weight. Ellen felt her breath catch, her heart pounding in her chest as the implications sunk in. Sacrifice herself? The thought clawed at her insides, a grotesque twist of fate. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "There has to be another way. The text is clear." Sarah insisted, her eyes wide with urgency. "If you don't, the spirits will grow stronger, and they'll consume everything in their path, including you and all of us." Mark's laughter echoed eerily in the temple, a dark sound that sent shivers down Ellen's spine. "You see, Sarah? She's meant for this. Embrace it, Ellen. Think of the power you could wield. You'd be a goddess among mortals." As the flames roared higher, illuminating the cavernous space, Ellen felt an intoxicating pull from the fire. The spirits were reaching out to her, offering her strength and dominion in exchange for her allegiance. Images of grandeur flashed before her, control over the elements, the ability to command the spirits, and a chance to end her own suffering. But beneath that seductive allure was a profound darkness, a yearning to consume everything she held dear. Her heart raced as she thought of her friends, her life beyond the village, the dreams she had yet to fulfill. "No," she cried, her voice breaking through the din of the flames. "I won't give in. I won't let you take me." Ellen felt the weight of her lineage press down upon her, and in that moment, a wave of clarity surged through her. She had a choice. Even if she was bound to this curse by blood, she could fight against it. She would not become a vessel for their wrath. She would not let Mark's madness destroy the village or the people within it. As she faced Mark, the air crackling with tension, the spirit's whispers turned frantic, urging her to yield. "You will never escape your destiny, Ellen. We will not be denied." The fire around them surged violently, responding to the turmoil within her heart. Shadows twisted and writhed, coiling around Mark like a serpent, seeking to claim him as well. The spirits seemed to sense her resistance, growing more agitated, their power radiating through the flames, seeking to break her resolve. "Mark," Ellen shouted, desperation lacing her voice. "Fight it. You're stronger than this. We can end this together." But he was lost, consumed by the fire's allure. "You're a fool, Ellen. Join me, and we can unleash the spirits. We can wield their power." His eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, a reflection of the chaos around them. Ellen stepped forward, bracing herself against the growing tempest. I refuse to be your pawn, Mark. We can break the cycle. We can lift this curse without destroying everything. The flames roared as if in response, the heat intensifying around her. In that moment, she made a decision. If it was her blood that tied her to the curse, it could also be her will that broke it. No, she shouted again, summoning every ounce of strength within her. I will not succumb to you. I will not embrace this darkness. As if sensing her determination, the spirits howled in protest, their rage filling the air like a thunderstorm. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the flames erupted, casting a fierce glow around the temple. Ellen reached deep within herself, summoning the connection she felt to the village, the knowledge and power that coursed through her veins. She could feel the spirits trying to latch onto her, whispering promises of power, but she fought back with everything she had. I refuse to be your vessel, she declared, raising her hands as if to physically push the darkness away. I choose to free you. I choose to stop this cycle. In that instant, something shifted. A pulse of energy surged through the temple, pushing back against the shadows that sought to claim her. The flames flickered, momentarily stalling as if caught in a struggle of their own. Mark staggered back, momentarily shaken by the force of her declaration. What are you doing? He shouted, his voice trembling as the spirit's influence began to weaken around him. I'm breaking the curse, Ellen said, her voice unwavering. I'm not afraid anymore. As she spoke, the shadows writhed, their howls echoing off the stone walls. The flames responded, swirling around her as if drawn to her defiance. With each word, Ellen felt the power building, a connection to the ancient forces that had cursed this village. Spirits of the past, I hear you. I acknowledge your pain, your suffering, but I will not let you consume my life or the lives of those I love. You will find peace, not through destruction, but through understanding. The fire blazed brighter, illuminating the entire temple. The spirits howled in fury, but Ellen stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She was not a vessel for their wrath. She was a beacon of hope, a light to guide them away from darkness. As the flames swirled and danced around her, Ellen could feel the connection to her ancestors deepening. They were not just shadows of the past, they were part of her, and in that moment, she understood. She had the power to free them, to release them from the curse without sacrificing herself or her friends. Let go of your anger. Embrace the light, she called out, her voice rising above the cacophony. Together we can break this cycle. I am willing to listen to your stories and understand your pain. The spirits hesitated, their rage flickering in the flames. Ellen felt a shift in the energy around her, a flicker of hope piercing through the darkness. Please, she implored, find peace in your rest. Let this village heal, and let us honor your memories without succumbing to violence. Slowly, the flames began to calm, the shadows receding as if caught in the pull of her conviction. The howls of the spirits transformed into whispers, and Ellen sensed their anguish slowly giving way to acceptance. Mark, watching in stunned silence, seemed to come back to himself. The madness in his eyes faded, replaced by confusion and fear. Ellen, he whispered, barely audible above the fading tumult. What's happening? I'm breaking the curse, she said softly, her focus unwavering. Together, we can end the cycle of pain. Trust me. As the last remnants of fury ebbed away, Ellen stood at the center of the temple, engulfed in the warmth of the flame, feeling the spirits finally loosening their grip on her soul. She was not their enemy. She was their voice. The flames surged upward, illuminating the darkened corners of the temple, and for a moment, the air shimmered with a golden light. Ellen felt the spirits drawing closer, their whispers becoming a soothing melody, enveloping her in a blanket of warmth and safety. In that moment, she knew she had not just saved herself or her friends. She had liberated the spirits bound to this place, allowing them to transcend their pain and find solace in the afterlife. As the light enveloped her, Ellen felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her, a connection to her ancestors and the village she had never known. The curse was broken. The cycle had ended, but she would never forget the sacrifices made, nor the power of understanding that could bridge the divide between the living and the dead. And with that final realization, Ellen knew she would carry their stories with her, honoring their memory and ensuring that the darkness would never return. Chapter 8: Extinguishing the Flames. As the flickering glow of the flames danced around her, Ellen felt a profound weight settle upon her shoulders. It was a heavy realization that she could no longer escape. The truth was clear. To save the village and her friends, she would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. The realization twisted her heart, a bittersweet pang that resonated with the strength of her decision. The ancient temple stood silent, its stones now alive with the pulse of the spirits that had been so restless, so angry. She could feel them swirling around her, their whispers rising and falling like the crackling fire itself. They were no longer just shadows of the past. They were souls searching for peace, and Ellen had to be the one to offer it. "Sarah," Ellen called, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling within her. "I need you to trust me. This is the only way." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief, her face a mask of horror. "Ellen, no. There has to be another way. You can't do this." But Ellen could feel the flames beckoning her, and with each heartbeat, her resolve strengthened. "I have to. This is my destiny. If I light the final flame, it will bind the spirits and lift the curse once and for all." Mark, who had been slowly returning to himself, looked at Ellen with a mixture of fear and understanding. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself for us. We can find another way, together. I've come to realize that this is not just about me or any of us. It's about the village, the people who have suffered for so long. If I don't do this, the curse will continue to haunt them, and the spirits will remain trapped in a cycle of torment." Tears brimmed in Sarah's eyes as she grasped Ellen's hands tightly. "You're my best friend. I can't lose you like this." "I know, and I'm so sorry," Ellen replied, her voice softening. "But this is my choice. You both have to promise me you'll remember what happened here and honor those who have been lost. Their stories need to be told." With that, Ellen turned her gaze to the ancient altar at the center of the temple. It was adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with energy, alive with the echoes of the past. She stepped forward, determination igniting within her. "Spirits of this land," she called, her voice rising above the flames. "I offer myself to you. Let my sacrifice bring you peace and finally extinguish the flames of your suffering. I will bind you to this flame, and in doing so, I hope to set you free." As she reached for the final torch, the air thickened with anticipation. The spirits, once restless, began to calm, their whispers morphing into a soft chant that resonated deep within the stone walls. Ellen's heart raced as she lit the torch, feeling the heat envelop her like an old friend. The flames flared brighter, licking the air with a hunger that matched the urgency of her heart. The fire began to consume the ancient altar, curling around her as if welcoming her embrace. She could feel the spirits drawing closer, their energy swirling around her, whispering words of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Ellen," they seemed to say. "You have given us hope." With each breath, Ellen felt herself slipping away, the flames drawing her deeper into their warmth. She could see the village in her mind, the laughter of children, the bustle of daily life, the bonds of community forged through adversity. All of it was worth the sacrifice. As the fire enveloped her, Ellen felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. Memories of her friends flooded her mind, moments of joy, laughter, and love, and with them came a profound understanding. She was not just extinguishing the flames, she was creating a new beginning for everyone left behind. "Remember me," she whispered, as the flames consumed her completely. The temple erupted in a blinding light, illuminating the darkened corners of the cavern. Sarah and Mark shielded their eyes as the intense heat washed over them, forcing them to retreat to the back of the chamber. They watched in silence, hearts heavy with sorrow, as the flames danced around Ellen, transforming into a radiant vortex of energy. The cacophony of whispers crescendoed into a harmonious choir, an echo of voices that filled the space with an ethereal beauty. Sarah clutched Mark's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. The fire began to shift, drawing in the remnants of the cursed spirits, swirling them into a spiraling dance of light. Ellen's sacrifice was not just a final act of defiance. It was a promise of liberation, a cleansing of the darkness that had plagued the village for centuries. As the light intensified, Sarah felt a warmth envelop her, a gentle embrace that seemed to whisper that everything would be all right. The villagers, long tormented by the curse, were finally free, and Ellen's legacy would live on in their hearts. But as the fire began to fade, the air thick with the remnants of magic and sorrow, the world around them started to shift. The shadows that had once ruled the village began to recede, leaving behind a sense of peace and calm. The curse was finally lifted, and the village began to breathe again. Mark, shaken by the magnitude of the loss, stood in silence, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew Ellen had made the right choice. She had given them a chance to start anew. "Come on, Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We should go." They turned to leave the temple, their hearts heavy with grief, yet filled with a glimmer of hope. As they stepped into the sunlight, the warm rays bathed them in light, a stark contrast to the darkness they had endured. The village was alive, the air sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, the sounds of laughter echoing in the distance. But just as they were about to take their first steps towards freedom, a flicker of movement caught Sarah's eye. In the distance, she spotted a small flame dancing along the horizon, its glow a stark reminder of the darkness they had fought so hard to extinguish. "Mark, look!" she gasped, pointing towards the flickering light. "What is that?" he murmured, squinting against the sun. The small flame grew larger, its intensity undulating as it flickered and danced, teasing the edges of the horizon. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the significance of what they were witnessing. Was it possible that the curse hadn't been fully lifted? Was there still a remnant of the darkness lurking just beyond their grasp? The flame pulsed ominously, casting an eerie glow over the village, as if mocking their hard-won victory. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she felt the weight of unease settle over her like a shroud. "Maybe we should go back," Mark said, his voice laced with trepidation. "No," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "We can't let fear dictate our lives. We have to believe that Ellen's sacrifice truly made a difference." But deep down, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. The flickering flame in the distance lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that some battles are never truly won. As they turned away from the ominous glow, the villagers' laughter echoed in the air, yet the lingering shadow of doubt remained. The village was alive again, but the haunting flicker of flame served as a reminder that darkness can never truly be extinguished. It can only be contained, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And as Sarah and Mark walked away from the village, leaving behind the echoes of a past that had shaped their futures, they carried with them the knowledge that peace is often fragile, and the fight against the shadows may never truly end.